Right. So, okay, thanks for that, John, and thanks for the invitation to come to Stroud. It's really nice to be in Stroud and to talk about vitalism and the machine, which I guess has always been a kind of they've been things I've been interested in for a long time. So it's really nice to get this opportunity to kind of think through some of the, some of these kind of ideas. And this is relating mostly to my kind of kinetic art. So this is just a little clip that I took in my studio a couple of days ago. So this is the kind of kinetic work I make. I call these things plants, like rubber plants. They're made from silicon rubber. And I'll try to relate this a little bit to science fiction and horror as well, which I'm very interested in, and to psychoanalysis a little bit. So this is, I think this was used as a poster for this talk. This is a diagram. I do a lot of diagramming. I'm involved with this social morphologies research unit, and previously a group called DRUG, the Diagram Research Use and Generation Group, John was part of as well. This is an example of something I call a social body mind map. It's a kind of pedagogical tool which I use with students, with groups of students, to kind of get them to think in a particular way about what they're doing with their artwork. And the point about the social body mind map, unlike a normal mind map, is you don't begin with something like an idea or something like me, but you kind of get rid of the subject in a way, and you put the artwork, something that you might be working on, that you might have done, that you might want to do, as a sort of question mark. It becomes a kind of alien object. So it's almost like a kind of alienation technique to remove yourself from the picture and begin to think about what are the kind of strands of kind of connections, what are the kind of tentacles that connect this work, that bring it about in the first place, and how to represent this, how to kind of express this in some way. So this is what I did as an example myself, based on the rubber plants that you've seen. And as you can see from this, there's various things that I connect this to as the kind of conditions of possibility of this thing. I've got a bunch of books here. Freud Lacan, who I'll talk a little bit about. H.P. Lovecraft, which I'm not going to talk about, but I could talk for hours about H.P. Lovecraft, but you might get a sense of that anyway. And nature over here, which is obviously important for these kind of strange kind of protuberances. And of course it's all plugged into an electric grid. Without energy, none of this would really work. Romero's there also, another kind of horror figure. I'll talk a little bit about zombies, but not Romero. So I've been doing kinetic work for a long time, for 20 years, since I left art college. The first ones I did were basically kind of re-engineered Walkmans. And this was kind of before, MP3s and all that kind of stuff. People were using kind of CD players at that time, and so these old cassette players were really kind of redundant material. I'd find them on Brick Lane and in kind of flea markets and car boot sales and stuff. People would just be kind of getting rid of this stuff. A lot of them didn't work, so I'd kind of buy them and reanimate them, almost like a kind of Frankenstein's monster. But instead of playing the tapes, I'd attach a little arm to them and attach them to the wall, so they would kind of push themselves with the tape mechanism against the wall, so they'd basically be kind of head-butting the wall, or kind of they'd be like a little woodpecker or something. I called them man machines, which was a bit of a joke. They're kind of cyborgs, but like the most abject kind of cyborgs that you could imagine. And this one's called Man Machines Get Back to Nature, which seemed to fit the theme of today. On the right, this is a more recent painting I did for the exhibition Psychobotanical at Matt's Gallery. And I guess this is kind of the context in which I made the social body mind maps. The painting describes what I think of as the kind of four primary kind of theories about where the artwork comes from. If you kind of think about what constitutes an artwork, and I'm showing this because these things are always kind of retrospective when you kind of think about what made you do these things. Why did I start making these machines in the first place? I mean, there's lots of reasons. A couple of the reasons are to do with, I guess, are to do with me looking at artwork and thinking about how these artworks take on a meaning. And it seemed to me there's a kind of long-standing kind of idea, kind of romantic idea, I suppose, in which, at the top left, the artwork is created by the artist. The artist is a kind of godlike figure that kind of creates something, whether that's through some kind of inspiration or through some kind of special ability or talent, or whether it comes straight from their head, like an idea. So this is something which I encounter a lot amongst art students. You ask them about the work and they will always start describing the work in terms of an idea that they've had, and often the work that you're looking at bears very little resemblance to what they're describing. So that's kind of one idea about the idea, I guess, of a kind of Frankenstein monster, that you kind of create something as a god, and this is something like a cyborg or a robot, or something which is brought back to life in some way, or kind of brought to life. On the bottom right, if you can see that, this is a kind of theory of the origin of art, which is institutional. In other words, whatever you stick in a gallery becomes art by definition. It's a kind of institutional kind of speech act, if you like. And this is the idea of autonomy, which anyone who's involved in art kind of deals with this question of autonomy. And autonomy is a tricky one. On the one hand, you don't want your art to be instrumentalized in some way. Might not want it to be a means to an end in some way, particularly if it's someone else's end. But the whole kind of idea of autonomy is a bit of a fetish, and something highly ideological, and something which the art market itself thrives on. The idea that the art is somehow completely disconnected from anything outside it, from any kind of other factors. And of course, this is all highly kind of constructed through things like the White Cube Gallery, which is there to give the impression that the work exists separate from anything outside it. So, thinking about this more recently, I thought maybe part of the idea of making kinetic sculpture was a kind of annoyance of this kind of magical act that happened, this kind of fetishistic kind of bringing something to life just through that institutional apparatus. And so the autonomy becomes an automaton, it becomes automatic, it becomes something kind of dumb, something which I plug in and kind of moves on its own. And in that way it becomes a bit debased. Kinetic art is a bit of a debased art form. It's a bit kind of idiotic, it's a bit kind of stupid and entertaining and all those things that art's not supposed to be. So there's that side of it. Right, now I've got some I want to show a video at this point. Is that okay, Joe? You could show the first video, this is from the my recent exhibition, The Origin of Life, at Beaconsfield Gallery, which is made up of 21 old synthesizer keyboards, the kind of stuff that again is a kind of redundant materials. I tend to use stuff which is cheap, which is redundant, which I can kind of pick up. I'm not into anything complicated, anything too animatronic, or anything which involves kind of computer programming or anything like that. It's all very, very simple stuff. This operates through kind of sensors and through the people who are visiting, triggering off sensors that operate these machines. So I've made these keyboards before with these are the same kind of material, this kind of silicon rubber that I use in the plant sculptures. It's a material I really like, this kind of strange, almost kind of bodily or kind of organic quality and kind of quite fetishistic quality to it as well. So it has all kinds of associations, I guess. But in this piece, I had a problem in this gallery. This is a beautiful old. Used to be a poor ragged school in the 19th century, and so it's a very, very old floor. So I wanted to make use of the floors. Everything's about people walking around. But I had there was a problem, and that is that nobody invigilates this space at all. So I immediately had this problem of either I keep everything going constantly, and this show was on for like 5 weeks, which is definitely a problem because things kind of run down and break, or I find a way around that. So this was the idea of the sensors. So nothing comes on until the sensors are triggered. The keyboards are triggered through these kind of sensors. And the point being that the sensors are also not necessarily next to the keyboards. So it's very hard to work out what's going on. And even though the sensors are in clear view, nothing's hidden. The impression is that the kind of feedback I got from people was they didn't see these sensors. They thought it was kind of all pre-done, or people go around doing that a lot, which is quite funny because it doesn't work actually. But I was going to call this exhibition Stuck Machines, which is something I'm interested in, repetition, which I'll talk a bit more, the kind of compulsion to repeat. But I decided to call it The Origin of Life, and I think it was maybe a kind of moment in me making this work where I'm kind of opening things up a little bit to unpredictability and even to kind of musicality. Although nothing about this is composed, things start happening which are out of my control, but they're out of my control not necessarily in a kind of neurotic way, but in a kind of interesting, I don't know, more kind of I don't know the word to use really, but let's say in a kind of positive, maybe in a kind of more positive way. And if I get time, I want to talk about these two kind of elements. One, this kind of compulsive repetition thing, which is a more kind of Freudian, Lacanian thing, and something more kind of open and vitalist, which is a more kind of Deleuzian thing. But let's see if I have time to do that. Now, I've got a couple of examples of this kind of animation, this kind of vitalist kind of coming to life, one from kind of science fiction and one from horror. So if you could play the next clip, please.
Bill, do me a favor. Come on. Just go home, okay?
You just sit down, will you?
Barry? Herschel, you're very sweet of you. Better than the hot. Did you find out?
Honey?
Well, I can thank you. Well, like starters, the hospital authorities, the better health services,
Honey?
the children's office, the bar association. I even talked to
Barry!
the investigator. Would you believe 270
Barry! Barry!
police? That's about almost $1 million. It's a lot. Yeah.
And he's off, and he's gone to find the UFOs. Obviously, you know. That scene just kind of came to me at some point when I was in the exhibition, watching the keyboards. It suddenly kind of reminded me of that scene, which I hadn't thought of for years. So it's probably lodged there somewhere, and I've kind of remembered it very differently from how I'd seen it. Okay, let's play this one.
Oh, double barrel here! Blow your butts! The kingdom come!
See if we don't.
So that's Evil Dead 2, and but the point of showing those two together is they're both kind of forms of something coming to life through some kind of external force. So in the case of Close Encounters, that's some kind of futuristic, highly advanced kind of technology, bringing these toys back to life and causing all kinds of strange disturbances. We don't seem at all natural. In the case of the Evil Dead, it's some kind of ancient evil. That's some kind of demonic force. That's the characters being or the whole kind of hut is being possessed by. This, I don't know how many people know this book, Roadside Picnic, but it's this is the book that the film Stalker is based on, the famous Tarkovsky Soviet sci-fi film. The Roadside Picnic is written by a couple of Russian sci-fi authors, and it's very, very different from the film. Basically, what happens is that there's these places in the world called zones. This place called the Zone, which might be in Canada or North America somewhere, and it's this place where the aliens have landed, or something strange has happened, and it's taking on all this kind of strange dimensions where it's an incredibly dangerous place, but at the same time it's changed all these objects into objects with almost kind of magical power. So you have these kind of batteries that they basically last forever, and then all kinds of other strange things are happening. For example, the dead are coming back from their graves, and they're going back home again, and they're just kind of sitting on the sofa with their families. So there's these people called stalkers who go in there illegally, and then they get these things which are worth a lot of money, and they sell it back to the government and the military and so on, who are also going in there to try to get this stuff and work out what's happened. So here Noonan meets one of the scientists, Valentine. So and they're having a few drinks, they're getting a bit tipsy. Richard Noonan, smirking, ordered, and Valentine's just explained to him that statistically there's all these kind of strange things that happen where somebody who lives close to the zone, when they move to another area where there's no zones, the car crashes increase, the rates of cancer go up, planes drop from the sky. So there's these strange statistical anomalies which seem to have no cause and effect. So Richard Noonan, smirking, ordered another shot of cognac for the laureate and another beer for himself. Then he said, "All right, I'm of course sympathetic to your turmoil, but to be honest, I personally find the reanimated corpses much more disturbing than your statistical data, especially since I've never seen the data, but the corpses I've seen and smelled them too." Valentine gave a careless wave. "Oh, you and your corpses," he said. "Listen, Richard, aren't you ashamed of yourself? After all, you're an educated man. Do you really not see that from the perspective of fundamental principles, these corpses of yours are neither more nor less astonishing than the perpetual batteries? It's just that the space cells violate the first principle of thermodynamics, and the corpses the second. That's the only difference. In some sense, we're all cavemen. We can't imagine anything more frightening than a ghost or a vampire. But the violation of the principle of causality, that's actually much scarier than a whole herd of ghosts, or Rubinstein's monsters, or is that Wallenstein, Frankenstein?" So I thought maybe this was quite a good definition. I mean, I'm probably kind of you could probably prove me wrong, but I thought maybe that's quite a good definition of the difference between sci-fi and horror, where sci-fi is concerned with the violation of the first law of thermodynamics. The first law of thermodynamics is basically you can't have a perpetual motion machine because any energy that's going to come out has to be put in there in the first place. The second, and horror is to do with the violation of the second law of thermodynamics, which is basically you can't reverse time. There's such a thing as entropy, which means the increasing chaos, order turns to chaos, and that's the kind of whole zombie thing. That's the whole kind of coming back to life of the dead, and so on. Okay, so life. So what is life? Now I don't know about you, but I think there's something really weird about life, and I think I've always thought that. And I remember it was either Life on Earth, David Attenborough, or it was Cosmos, Carl Sagan. But it was seeing those images of kind of cell division, and it was that question of where did life come from? What was the origin of life? So there's a kind of, although we're all supposed to we're supposed to have kind of got beyond kind of ideas of vitalism, there's something which persists, I think, and I think it's in sci-fi and even more so in horror. I think that this kind of intuition, this kind of vitalist kind of sense is expressed, which is really to do with the kind of weirdness of life and what it is and why things wriggle about in the first place, and why it isn't all just kind of rocks and clouds or whatever. So the question of vitalism is life simply a special form of existence or motion of matter, which is the kind of materialist kind of negation of vitalism, or is it a distinct non-material force which animates matter? In other words, is life something actually separate from matter, which becomes animated in some way, just like the the moose's heads and the little robots and so on? Where does the creative force or formation, regulation and reproduction come from? So even if we take a kind of materialist view, where does this kind of force of formation and kind of movement and reproduction and so on come from? Now this is a quote from Elizabeth Gross, which I might come back to in the end, although I might not get there. She says, "Life, that excess within matter that seeks to extend matter beyond itself and its present forms." And this is in relation to Bergson and to Gilles Deleuze, a French philosopher who was, according to Gross, principally influenced by Bergson above all other philosophers. And Bergson had this notion of creative evolution and the élan vital, is that how you say it?
Élan vital.
The élan vital, some kind of vital impetus life force or something. So what is this? I mean, this is not, anti-scientific, although it does seem that way in some sense. But I think the word to highlight here is excess. There's something excessive. There's something excessive when matter forms together in such a way, when molecules form together in such a way that they start enfolding, enveloping each other, moving, and then reproducing themselves. What on earth is going on? What on earth is going on? I don't know. But the origin of life. So the exhibition at Beaconsfield was named after this great book by a Soviet scientist called A.J. Oparin, and I picked up this book once for 50p or something, and it's a book from 1953 where Oparin lays out his own kind of theories of where life may have come from, but he kind of structures a whole argument of this book in a very kind of dialectical, materialist, and actually a very kind of orthodox Soviet kind of way of setting materialism, and particularly dialectical materialism, against idealism. So idealism for him is the enemy, and all the kind of ideas of vitalism and spontaneous self-formation of whatever the kind of myths used to be of kind of frogs kind of forming out of matter and so on. He kind of locates this within this kind of wider trajectory where he's kind of quoting Engels and Lenin and Stalin alongside Darwin and various people. But he's got this wonderful conclusion where he sums up his whole kind of arguments around the book. So we have thus traversed the long road of the development of matter which led to the origin of life on the Earth. At first we found carbon scattered in the form of separate atoms in the red-hot stellar atmospheres. Then we found it as a component of hydrocarbons which appeared on the surface of the Earth. With time, these hydrocarbons were transformed into their oxygenous and nitrogenous derivatives into the simplest organic substances. In the waters of the primitive oceans, these substances formed more complex compounds. Proteins and similar substances appeared. Thus, the material of which the bodies of plants and animals are formed came into being. At first, this material existed in its dissolved state, then it began to separate from its environment in the form of coacervate drops. And this is his own theory. The first coacervate drops were of simple structure, but gradually substantial changes took place in their structure. They acquired a more and more complex and improved structure and were finally transformed into primary living beings, the forebears of all life on the Earth. Life continued to develop. The first living beings were not cellular, but at a definite stage of life's development, the cell appeared. Unicellular and later multicellular organisms established themselves on our planet. Thus does science refute such religious figments as the spiritual source of life and the divine origin of living creatures. The modern achievements of natural science, which reveal the laws governing the origin and development of life, deal crushing blows to idealism and metaphysics, to the entire reactionary ideology of imperialism. He does have one further paragraph where he says that we're very close to basically being able to create life. It's just a question of kind of mechanics in some ways, it's a question of kind of organising chemicals in certain ways. Right. Now, this is a wonderful book. I really recommend it, called The Logic of Life. Francois Jacob, this was published in 1970. And he kind of traces the scientific thinking around this question of life from the Renaissance, really, to the later half of the second half of the 20th century. the kind of Renaissance, it's still kind of involved in kind of medieval ideas of looking for the signature of the creator in the forms of life. So it's very much a kind of visual thing, and you find analogies and you try to discover what is the secret language that God is telling us, because God creates everything, not just at the beginning, but everything separately all the time. So we are each creature, human or animal or plant, is created uniquely by God, or if not by God, by the devil, or potentially by some minion of the devil, like a witch or something. And then you have this shift in the classical period, which is really the 17th century, the time of the as John was describing, the invisible college with people like Boyle and Hooke and Christopher Wren and so on, and of course Descartes. And there's kind of progenitors like Da Vinci, like Vesalius and so on. So he says, during the classical period, the problem was no longer to discover the secret signs of nature's intention. It had now become the penetration of nature. In other words, you're not just looking on the surface, you're getting inside something, right? You're kind of analysing it, you're taking it apart. The question is no longer how nature was created, but how it works now. Everything is arranged, connected and harmonised not from without as a result of some occult force inaccessible to human reason, but from within by the chain of laws themselves. The 17th century found itself in a universe in which stars and stones obeyed the laws of mechanics. All nature was a machine. Okay, so this is the kind of mechanistic conception of what is life. But importantly, at this point, life is not separated from non-life. The organic and the non-organic are not separated. They're all kind of one. So the stars and the stones obey the laws of mechanics, just as an animal or human did. The big separation, obviously, with Descartes, the Cartesian dualism, is between mind and matter, or between the human soul, or whatever it is. That's what distinguishes humans, not the fact that they're living beings. So we have Descartes. The body as a kind of machine, there's nerves, there's senses, there's the brain or the pineal gland. Descartes was very, very important in decoding these kind of sensory, whether it's vision or heat or whatever it is. You dissect the animal, you take it apart, you look at it as a kind of piece of clockwork almost. It's very, very complicated, but you can work it out, particularly with the new microscopes and so on. And on the right, a mechanical duck. This is from the 18th century. These kind of automatons started being made. They were a bit rubbish, really. This duck was supposed to eat seeds and then kind of shit them out, but in fact the pellets that came out were kind of preloaded, so it didn't really work properly. But even if it did, there was no sense of metabolism. There was no sense that these seeds were kind of feeding it in like a battery, like some kind of energy system. If you didn't feed it the seeds, this duck wasn't going to go and seek out the seeds. So that kind of machinery those kind of robots would wait until the kind of cybernetic revolution in the mid-20th century, and the idea of kind of homeostatic metabolic systems. Animals were like machines, and someone asked Descartes, what about these kind of terrible cries that the animals make if they're undergoing vivisection? He said, don't worry, the animals don't feel pain. They don't have a soul, so they don't feel pain. This is a quote I got from by Silvia Federici called Caliban and the Witch, and it's a quote from someone working at the Port Royal, one of the big kind of scientific establishments in Paris. They said that the animals were clocks, that the cries they emitted when struck were only the noise of a little spring which had been touched, but the whole body was without feeling. It's a kind of slightly horrific example of how theory has real consequences. Interestingly, for Jacob, vitalism is not something which is gradually kind of done away with through this kind of more materialistic way of thinking, mechanical way of thinking. For him, it's something which only really exists at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century. So this is interesting. So why is this? Well, for him, it's because life becomes separated from non-life in the late 18th, early 19th century, and this, no doubt, has something to do with the Industrial Revolution. It has something to do with questions no longer of mechanics, but of energy, right? Energy becomes very, very important. It becomes very important for capitalism. Becomes very important in terms of that excess that I mentioned earlier, which then becomes a kind of surplus, right? How do you get surplus? How do you get something from nothing in a way? How do you kind of violate the law of entropy? So to maintain the cohesion of the organism, to ensure order in the living being as opposed to the disorder of inanimate matter, there had to be a particular quality which Kant called an internal principle of action. There had to be life. For the young science of biology, so biology only really comes about in the 19th century as a discipline, it is the obscure force that gives organised bodies their essential characteristics and keeps their molecules together, despite the external forces that tend to separate them. So it's something about order against the disorder of inorganic existence. The living being captures the power of life in some way. It fixes and immobilises this force, but only momentarily, since it is destroyed precisely by what has made life itself spring forth. The living is reduced to a heap of matter that life has fleetingly touched. So we're essentially a bunch of matter, a bunch of stuff, something quite abject, which then organises itself through this force that we call life. Now, I'm going to move to Freud and another origin myth. I call these origin myths in the sense of a story, because all science is mythical, all science is narrative based, and I love these kind of origin stories. I've got a kind of collection of them, and one of my favourite for a long time is the one that Freud tells in his very kind of enigmatic and rich and strange and speculative essay Beyond the Pleasure Principle. What is Beyond the Pleasure Principle about? It's written in 1920 by Freud, and it comes about because he'd been treating patients with shell shock from the First World War. And these patients had these recurring dreams of kind of horrific things that happened to them. Bombs exploding, their friends dying, limbs going everywhere. And it was because they weren't prepared for this eventuality, because you'd sit around in trenches for weeks, be incredibly bored, and then suddenly a bomb would explode. So this is trauma. It's what's now called post-traumatic stress disorder. At that time, it was called the war neurosis or shell shock. It violated Freud's theory of the pleasure principle, and what Freud meant by pleasure is not what we would normally use that word. For Freud, pleasure for the psychical apparatus, for this kind of economic system, meant the reduction of tension, the reduction of excitation. The psychic system doesn't want too much excitement. It wants a nice balance, right? It can take so much, but then it needs to kind of calm things down. And this operates in the dream. Dreams are basically, they're kind of wish fulfillments, as Freud said in his kind of breakthrough work from 20 years earlier, Interpretation of Dreams. So this is something which really struck at the heart of Freud's own theory, and he here tries to work out what this is. And he comes up with this idea that he calls the compulsion to repeat. There's a kind of compulsion to repeat, which on the one hand seems to work in the service of the pleasure principle. So even for something quite extreme like these disturbing nightmares, which are recurring and happen all the time, there's a kind of sense in which this repetition retroactively prepares the injured patient for this shock that they're about to have. So it's serving a kind of function of anxiety, of kind of fear, where you prepare. Fear is a kind of way with which the body and the psychical system prepares for something horrible to happen. It's a kind of instinct where you might have a kind of fight or flight response. But on the other hand, and Freud gives lots and lots of examples, of how we all repeat stuff that is totally bad for us, and then we think, why have we done that again? This is like, we're in this situation again, we can't believe it. It seems to go against all kind of rational planning and kind of experience and so on. And it happens in the neurosis, it happens in the kind of transference in psychoanalysis as well. So Freud stipulates that perhaps there's something primal about this compulsion to repeat, and he eventually comes up with this idea of the death instinct. And here it is. Here's his kind of theory of life. I'm only going to read the first part of it. The second part is to do with the life instincts, the instinct to gather together and to reproduce. The first part is to do with a kind of singularity, a kind of individuality in a way. So this is the myth. The attributes of life were at some point evoked in inanimate matter by the action of a force of whose nature we can form no conception. It may perhaps have been a process similar in type to that which later caused the development of consciousness in a particular stratum of living matter. The tension which then arose in which had hitherto been an inanimate substance endeavoured to cancel itself out. In this way the first instinct came into being, the instinct to return to the inanimate state. It was still an easy matter at that time for a living substance to die. The course of its life was probably only a brief one, whose direction was determined by the chemical structure of the young life. For a long time perhaps, living substance was thus being constantly created afresh and easily dying till decisive external influences altered in such a way as to oblige the still surviving substance to diverge ever more widely from its original source of life and to make ever more complicated detours before reaching its aim of death. The circuitous path to death, faithfully kept to by the conservative instincts, would thus present us today with a picture of the phenomenon of life. If we firmly maintain the exclusively conservative nature of instincts, we cannot arrive at any other notions as to the origin and aim of life. So what Freud's setting up there is a very kind of strange picture. I mean, first of all, why is he going back to biology and the kind of origin of life? And what he seems to be saying life is life is a kind of irritation. It's a kind of tension that you want to cancel out. Something came to life at some point, God knows how, we still don't know how, and it immediately wanted to cancel itself out. Whatever that wanting might mean, it wants to become a kind of inanimate kind of rock or something again, when it's nice and calm and it doesn't have any kind of tension, whatever it is, the heat of the sun or the water or something kind of bothering it. So it's a very kind of negative view of what life is. But the strange thing about it is it's what Freud calls an organic elasticity. The organic wants to return to something which previously existed. It's a bit like the good old days. Things were better before. Things were better when I was still a rock or something. It was kind of inorganic. But it wants to do it in its own way. So it doesn't just want to. It can't stand the tension. So it doesn't want to get frazzled by the sun or something, because that increases the tension. So the quick way to death cannot be taken. It has to take a circuitous route to death. And of course, Freud has a whole chapter where he starts talking about what is the necessity to death. Why is death locked into the program, the genetic program of each one of us, right? Why is it that we're all destined to die? Again, nobody quite knows the answer to that. Richard Dawkins might say, because we're just hosting the genes that are the real masters and so on. But this is a death drive. And the interesting thing about this whole essay is that Freud is returning to work he did 25 years ago, which was his final attempt as a neurologist, when he was still a neurologist, to develop a kind of theory of the neurosis and a theory of various other kind of things like consciousness, like memory, like empathy and so on, with a kind of neurological model, which he ended up failing to do in something called the Project. Now, what is the brilliant interpretation of this essay is by Jacques Lacan. Jacques Lacan was a French psychoanalyst whose whole kind of mission in life was to return to Freud, was to return to the radicality of Freud, which he had seen had been kind of dampened down and kind of pacified, particularly through things like ego psychology. And the radicality of Freud had to do with precisely these kind of things like the death drive, where Freud reintroduces, against people like Jung, he reintroduces a kind of duality. It's not a Cartesian duality anymore, but it's a duality, the duality of the conscious versus the unconscious, for example, or the duality of the life drive versus the death drive, okay? Or the duality of these two types of repetition. Repetition on the one hand, which Lacan says is to do with restitution, that's a kind of conservative notion of repetition, where we try to reinstate something in order to regain a balance. And then through this kind of dialectic of the death drive, repetition as what Lacan would call insistence. Insistence is where you just keep going, and this is where Lacan says the death drive is like a machine and the human is like a machine. So whereas Freud doesn't mention machines at all in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, he does mention demons. He says it's like a demonic possession. He doesn't mention machines. Lacan, using these new theories of cybernetics, returns to kind of Descartes, but kind of twists Descartes, turns Descartes into something else. He has these two different notions of the machine, the Cartesian notion of the machine and something that Lacan is going to call the symbolic order. And the symbolic order is a more kind of radical way of getting beyond the what Lacan would call the imaginary function of the ego, against ego psychology, against this thing about let's build up the ego, let's make the ego strong, and then the patient will all, then we'll all be kind of well functioning, well adapted human beings, right? Lacan doesn't want a well adapted human being. He wants something more radical, and he finds that in the death drive. This is from Seminar 2. So it's from 1956. It would be very easy to prove to you that the machine is much freer than the animal. The animal is a jammed machine. It's a machine with certain parameters that are no longer capable of variation. And why? Because the external environment determines the animal and turns it into a fixed type. It is in as much as compared to the animal, we are machines, that is to say something decomposed, that we possess greater freedom in the sense in which freedom means the multiplicity of possible choices. Lacan is basically saying that when Freud talks about the pleasure principle, he's talking about what cybernetics means by homeostasis. Homeostasis is the way in which feedback operates through both humans and machines to balance ourselves up. So when the boiler knows when the temperature's hot, then it will turn itself off. The air conditioner will do the opposite. When we start sweating, that's a mechanism so we don't get too hot. If it gets too cold, we start shivering. These are kind of feedback mechanisms which the cyberneticians called homeostasis. That's one kind of machine, which is actually the animal in a kind of Cartesian sense. That's the kind of mechanistic machine. But there's another machine, which is more like the death drive, and which Lacan would talk about in terms of the symbolic order rather than the imaginary order. So later on in Seminar 2, in the project, this is the 1896 neurological paper, before Freud becomes, invents psychoanalysis with the publication of the Interpretation of Dreams, or his slightly earlier studies on hysteria. In the project, Freud tried to build a theory of the functioning of the nervous system by showing that the brain operates as a buffer organ between man and reality as a homeostat organ. And he then comes up with, he stumbles on the dream. Okay, so it's not just the brain, it's not just the neurons, there's something else. There's this little machine which is functioning to produce dreams. He realizes that the brain is a dream machine, and it is in the dream machine that he discovers what was there all along and which hadn't been noticed, namely that it is at the most organic and most simple, most immediate and least manageable level, at the most unconscious level, that sense and speech are revealed and blossom forth in their entirety. He discovers the operation of the symbol as such, the manifestation of the symbol in the dialectical state, in the semantic state, in its displacements, puns, plays on words, jokes working all on their own in the dream machine. It took him another 20 years to be able to look back to his premises, that is, he's talking about beyond the pleasure principle, and to try to recover what it means in terms of energy. So Lacan's saying that in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud is going back to the kind of organic neurological studies of Freud, because Freud is dealing with a kind of anomaly in terms of his model of energy, which has gone beyond the pleasure principle through this kind of compulsion to repeat. And this what is this compulsion to repeat? Well, it's to do with the symbol, right? This is what it is. And what the symbolic order is a kind of intersubjective state, which means that we are condemned in some way, we are possessed in some way to repeat what has been passed on to us through these interconnections that we might have nothing to do with. So we're no longer the agent, we're no longer the kind of conscious agent of our action. Famously through the Oedipus complex, we're condemned to repeat what our parents did, right? What are all the kind of idiocies and mistakes of our parents. But we're also interlocked with all kinds of other humans which we come across either personally or impersonally, particularly through the machinery that we're able to develop because of mathematics, which is basically a symbolic machinery. So this is a piece from a couple of years ago, although originally made a long time ago, originally made about 17 years ago, called Renaissance Man. And this is kind of like with a kind of cast of my own face on this kind of this machine, very very kind of simple kind of thing, and some people see this as something quite horrific. People read it in different ways, but it, I guess, in a simple way, we can talk about it in terms of a kind of compulsion to repeat. A more recent painting which takes that man-machine and relates it to some of these kind of questions of energy and theories of thermodynamics in relation to the animal. If we can understand, if we can relate this to heat, then heat is simply one way in which energy exerts itself in the machine, and it's usually to do with a loss of work. When the machine is not working, it's because it's dissipating energy in the form of heat. So heat is a bad thing. Whereas in the animal, it's something necessary for life. If there's no heat, then there's death. I won't talk about this, but this is a kind of diagram of Beyond the Pleasure Principle. And this, what is this? Well, this is now what I would see as the more sophisticated we get in terms of what's going on inside the cell, we almost kind of reinvent the kind of these kind of mechanisms again. So this is a little motor protein that walks along this other protein structure in the cell. You know, it seems very cartoony. It's almost a bit like the Evil Dead 2, which has got kind of reference to early cartoons. It seems very purposeful. Where's it going? What's it doing? I mean, it's a model, so God knows what this actually looks like. We can't actually see it. But again, is this? Are we really getting beyond either vitalism or kind of a mechanistic universe? I don't know. I mean, I'm not a scientist. I'm a total amateur. Okay, because time is short, I will skip this. But there's another part to Lacan. There's the imaginary. There's the symbolic. A bit later on, it becomes much more interested in the real. And the real kind of brings us back to this idea of this kind of formless mass, this kind of organic, kind of abject stuff of which we are made. And this is the point where I think decomposition, which is a constant theme in terms of the imaginary of horror films. What horror films do is they imagine the real, you might say, a real with a capital R. And there's a kind of symmetry between this point of decomposition is also the kind of point of what used to be thought of kind of spontaneous generation, this kind of point of kind of vital energy, this point where something formulates, the maggots form and life is created from the mud and so on. And this is, so I'll kind of leave you with the facts in the case of Valdemar, which is a short story by Edgar Allan Poe. I don't know if anyone knows it. There's a fantastic story where someone agrees to be hypnotized on the point of death. Okay, so he's about to die and the guy hypnotizes him, and then he dies in all kind of medical sense, but he's not really dead because he's in this kind of strange in-between state, what Lacan would call in between the two deaths, the kind of symbolic death and the real death. The hypnotist then kind of wakes him up, he gets him to talk, he's still alive, he talks in a very, very strange way, not with his mouth but with his tongue. It's hideous, his lips have kind of come apart. He puts him back to sleep again, and then he leaves him for like 6 months, and then he comes back and he wakes him up, and these are the final lines. Okay, so he's woken him up. The guy is still in a kind of perfect state, as if he's been embalmed, as if he's been kind of put in formaldehyde. And he says, and I can't do the proper voice for this, but you can kind of imagine something like The Exorcist or something. So he says, for God's sake, quick, put me to sleep, or quick, waken me, quick, I say to you that I am dead. I was thoroughly unnerved, this is the hypnotist, and for an instant remained undecided what to do. At first I made an endeavour to recompose the patient, but failing in this, through total abeyance of the will, I retraced my steps and as earnestly struggled to awaken him. In this attempt I soon saw that I should be successful, or at least I soon fancied that my success would be complete. And I'm sure that all in the room, because he was surrounded by other doctors, were prepared to see the patient awaken. For what really occurred, however, it is quite impossible that any human being could have been prepared. As I rapidly made the mesmeric passes amid ejaculations of dead, dead, absolutely bursting from the tongue and not from the lips of the sufferer, his whole frame at once, within the space of a single minute or even less, shrunk, crumbled, absolutely rotted away beneath my hands. Upon the beds before the whole company there lay a nearly liquid mass of loathsome, of detestable putridity. I've been interested in a genre called melt movie, because one of my favourite films is Street Trash, and I recently did a homage to Street Trash where basically people melt, and this must be the first melt movie ever. And I don't know if anyone's you get these things on YouTube, like the 10 best melt movie clips, and none of them have this. I reckon this is
Wizard of Oz, though.
Wizard of Oz, yeah. So often people say the I can't remember. Anyway, yeah, maybe just play the.
You want me to play
Yes,
the
please.
point, sorry.
Yeah. Here he is. It's a silent film. There it is.
Semi-liquida.
It's fantastic. I mean, I was going to follow this with. I've got a film of melting Tory politicians. We could just put it on in silent while we do some. I've got Liam Fox lined up melting, so we could just show the next clip, and then maybe we can.
Yeah, let's do one. Let's do Liam Fox.
Yeah.
The society that puts equality before freedom will end up with neither. The society that puts freedom before equality will end up with a great measure of both.
We're looking at all our options. What you can say in the totality of that is that Britain is expanding and widening its global horizons. Some people took the view that our vote to leave the European Union was a vote for insularity. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. This is a genuinely outward-looking Britain that we're seeing emerging from that referendum.